Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So before we delve into the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine, we have to take a look at the current domestic situation here in the United States. So as most of you know, most Ivy League universities are currently under siege. Under siege by a group or a variety of groups, mainly radical left-wing groups. We have seen these groups come from the theocratic climate change. We see these groups coming from the homosexual and transvestite community. It's incredibly interesting to see that group is coming to support the Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. We see the anti-colonialists. And again, most of these are hardcore left-wing groups ranging from Antifa and a variety of different causes that mostly focus their attention on left-wing causes. Some of the most radical elements are not even members of the schools in question. They do not go to those schools, and they are paid agitators. They are paid insurrectionists to go to these schools and cause trouble around the United States. Now, what's really interesting is we see what's happening in Israel. We have seen this war between Hamas and the IDF going on now for quite some time. Has there been casualties? Yes, there have been casualties on both sides. Lots of casualties. Now, are these casualties, is this quote-unquote genocide that is thrown around quite often by these left-wing groups and the Arabs living in the Gaza Strip that support this terrorist organization known as Hamas? Is it genocide? Is it different in terms of scope and scale than some of the other conflicts that have been going on around the world? So let's just take a look at one. Tigray, in the former state of Ethiopia. Hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans starved to death, raped, and executed en masse by the regime of Abiy Ahmed. Barely one protest in the United States. Barely one protest that even made the news. The scale of what happened in the former state of Ethiopia is far more dramatic in terms of the loss of human life than what is going on in the Gaza Strip. Not just hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people being starved to death in the Tigray region. Millions. And not only that, we have seen the Abiy Ahmed regime utilize actual concentration camps throughout the former state of Ethiopia, in which they have sent Tigrayans, Oromo, anyone who opposes the government of Abiy Ahmed is at risk of being killed. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians uprooted, killed, and the loss of property, homes, gone by the Azeri army, seizing control of Nagorno-Karabakh. What do we see here in the United States? Nothing. Zero, zilch. So why is it that there is so much attention about this Gaza situation, which again really pales in comparison when you compare and contrast what has happened in Tigray, the former state of Ethiopia, Armenia, and some of these other places? Well, I'll tell you why. Money. Lots and lots of money. So let's look at Qatar. Let's get an idea of the scale of money and treasure that is being sent from this location to these left-wing universities and organizations here in the United States, and are essentially paying the salaries of these left-wing radical agitators. Here it is. And you really have to look at it to gain an understanding of just how much money is involved in the state of Qatar, Qatar, however you want to say it. Look at this. Unprecedented wealth. And a lot of this is injecting treasure, money, what have you, into many of these left-wing organizations here in the United States designed to cause trouble here in the United States. Look at this. Insane amounts of wealth. On a scale that you really can't even compare, even here in the United States. It's difficult to find wealth on this scale in the United States. It's here, but not like this. On a different scale. Now also, let's have a look at where some of this money is also coming from the United States. Now this may take me a little bit to find, but I'm going to find it. Here we go. There's Stamford. And if you go just to the northwest of Stamford, I think I'm going to run into it. We cross into the great state of New York, and we end up in Bedford, New York. Bedford, New York. This is the home of George Soros. George Soros has multiple estates in this area of Bedford, New York. And as a matter of fact, we are going to cross some of his estates. But again, compare and contrast, this is a very wealthy area of the United States. And this is where George Soros resides mostly. Again, multiple estates. I believe he bought one of the estates of the writer Michael Crichton. So he has probably 100 acres and probably 3 or 4 homes in this area of Bedford, New York. I understand even Donald Trump has a residence in this area as well. But again, if you look at this and then we swing back over to Qatar. This is where the real money's coming from. Okay? This is where the no-joke money is coming from. And you're talking palaces on a scale that's difficult to find in the United States. Look at these places. Incredible amounts of wealth. Obviously oil money. Then you have the expansive projects that are taking place in Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates, where they're creating the world, for instance. But this is where a lot of this money is coming from, to cause and create problems here in the United States. And yes, it's the interest of the high control cult that resides in this area, that most of the people in this region belong to. And I think you, the viewer, know what high control cult I am referring. I need not get into too in-depth about it, but that's where it's coming from. Many of these folks that are causing problems on universities in the United States right now are being paid. And that money has a trail. Now, swinging back over to the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. The Russians are now rattling the nuclear saber. Yes, the nuclear saber is being rattled by the Russians. Now look, if we go back to the 1970s, the 1980s, the United States, if it were to face off against the Soviet military that would launch itself across the border of Eastern Germany, if the U.S. were to see the breaking of its lines and the overrunning of its forces and the Russians threatening Hamburg and other Western German cities, the United States had a plan to first use tactical nuclear weapons to stop the Russians. So the first use of tactical nuclear weapons was something that the United States had in its doctrine. We also hear about the use of chemical weapons by the Russians against Ukrainians, against the Ukrainian military. So you need to hit the pause button there for a second. Are these chemical weapons the likes of which that kill people? No, they're not. This is where the mainstream media is coming out with reports, and they're shaping the narrative in a very untruthful manner. The Russians are using irritants. They're using CS gas. Are these chemical weapons? Not really. They're irritants, the likes of which would be used in a riot. I can tell you that when I was in the military, we would use CS gas on each other. In a training environment, yes, the United States would use the same quote-unquote chemical weapons irritants that the Russians are using against the Ukrainians. The United States Army would use these same CS agents on its own troops. I have been attacked and inhaled the same quote-unquote chemical weapons the Russians are using in the Ukraine. Same stuff. And it actually gave you, in terms of operating a armored vehicle, a tank, what have you, confidence that your nuclear, biological, and chemical system on your tank or armored infantry fighting vehicle actually worked. It was a training tool, a training aid. They would use the CS gas that obviously if you inhaled it, you would know you were inhaling something. But when you buttoned up your tank, you activated your NBC system, and you weren't coughing inside of your tank, you knew that your system worked. Same stuff. Same stuff that was used by the United States against its own forces, training for a fight against the Soviet Union. The same stuff is being used in the Ukraine. This is not the chemical weapons that kill people. This is not the chemical weapons that were used during World War I, such as mustard agents, blistering agents, sarin gas. This is not what the Russians are using. But when you hear the mainstream media say, the Russians are using chemical weapons, that is what the uninformed urbanite here in the United States immediately thinks. Oh, God, the Russians are using chemical weapons, because that's what the media says. And when you think about chemical weapons, you think about the chemical weapons that were used in Iraq against the Kurds. You think about gas weapons that were used in World War I. That is what the person who has never been in the military, the uninformed urbanite here in the United States, that's what they believe is being used. But that's not what's being used. CS gas. The United States, the ATF, the FBI, used a M88 armored recovery vehicle and injected gallons of CS gas, same CS gas that is being used in Ukraine, against the David Koresh compound in Waco. Same stuff. I've experienced it, and obviously those individuals on that David Koresh Branch Davidian compound experienced the same thing, except in an enclosed environment. So I wanted to talk about that as well. Again, false narratives. False narratives. So the breakout continues for Russian forces. The nuclear Saber is being rattled again. Think about the 80s. Think about the 70s. First use doctrine by the United States. Are the Russians contemplating it? I don't know. It's difficult to say at this point. I think it's possible the Russians could look to escalate. They could strike targets near the Polish-Ukrainian border. If there are weapon systems in eastern Poland, if there are weapon systems in northern Romania that are about to cross in and be used on Russian cities, do the Russians have a right to attack those sites? You think the United States wouldn't do this? You think the United States, for 1 minute, if it believed that it was going to be attacked from Canada or Mexico, it would not strike targets to prevent the United States from being hit? You bet we would. You bet we would. And this is why this war is becoming more and more dangerous. More to come very soon. Thank you for joining us today. As always, have a good day.